But my topic was suggested by Ramona, in the way Ramona has of suggesting things. But it was a great suggestion in light of the overwhelming responses to and the results of the hashtag #MeToo movement. I'm not an expert in employment discrimination or criminal law, nor have I been the target of sexual harassment, with the exception of one incident where a coworker told a very sexually offensive joke and thought that would intimidate me. I attribute my lack of experience being a target to many factors, including the fact that I've had such supportive and kind male supervisors and colleagues who I've had the pleasure to work with since the age of 14, including the MAP faculty in this room, and my colleagues with the museum attorneys groups, chief among them, Stephen Wild, who was my mentor, and Stephen Urice. Recently, Stephen Urice exchanged emails mourning the passing of Marie Malero, who was another giant in the museum field. And in reviewing the PowerPoint, I noticed that Stephen is standing behind me in this picture of the museum attorney group. And I said, he always had my back. Always, always. And I his. And nonetheless, as a woman, as an African American, as a sister of a sister who was sexually assaulted while in college on campus, as a sister who works in Hollywood, as a sister of a sister who's an engineer, who's constantly asked, how'd you end up heading up the project? As a daughter of a mother who left a job in the early 60s when her paycheck had been shortened. As the granddaughter of a very talented and very brilliant woman who was an elevator operator in a major department store in Boston until she got her job as a secretary to one of Boston's major art leaders. And as a great granddaughter of immigrants from Canada, it was challenging reading the literature because it hit so close to home. As you can tell or see from my use of images, historical context means a lot to me. And while monitoring the developments in the hashtag #MeToo campaign, I was struck by the fact that there was little historical context in many of the discussions about sexual violence and harassment. So for the next several minutes, I will discuss what I believe are 3 myths or false assumptions resulting from this lack of historical context. And I will share with you in closing some thoughts of what can be done on an individual level, organizationally, and on a societal level in confronting sexual harassment. Myth number 1. We're skipping definitions because to save time, I will have available at break some detailed definitions for you. So, myth number 1. The Me Too and Time's Up movements are significant because of the stories about sexual assault and abuse that those movements have unfolded. Well, the reality, as we all know, is that knowledge about horrific sexual assault and abuse, including in the workplace, is not new. In awarding the 2017 Time Magazine Person of the Year Award to the silence breakers of the Me Too campaign, the magazine stated, "This reckoning appears to have sprung up overnight, but in actuality has been simmering for years, for decades, for centuries." Next slide. Going back centuries, Emily Scott, the Lutheran pastor, wrote in a New York op-ed about the Bible's Me Too problem. She describes how by chance she happened to focus on the Bible chapter for the rape of Dinah. and its scene of violence, where a prince saw Dinah, seized her, and lay with her by force. She also recounts the story from Judges 19 of the Levite, who pushes his concubine outside the walls of the house to be gang raped by lawless mob. By morning, she's dead. The Levite later mutilates her body. Scott writes that the women of the Bible would know that the more vulnerable you are, a child, a woman of color, a foreigner, a slave or a concubine, a transgender man or woman, the more you are singled out to be used and discarded. Next slide. In the United States during the 18th and 19th century, sexual coercion was a fact of life and similarly of death for enslaved women and girls working in the South, as well as a common experience among the domestic workers in the North. Abolitionists worked tirelessly in the mid-19th century to bring public attention to the plight of the sexually assaulted on plantations. The open secret was readily apparent in the number of mulatto children fathered by white owners on plantations in the South and elsewhere. Enslaved women and men were subjected to brutal sexual abuse as an exercise of the power of their white owners to do so, and in the case of enslaved women, as a means of producing more wealth in the form of more enslaved bodies as chattel. Next slide. In the early 20th century, women employed in the manufacturing and clerical industries confronted physical and verbal assaults from male supervisors. By the 1920s and through the 1970s, working women were advised to quit their jobs if they could not handle the inevitable sexual advances, and they really talked openly about the issue. It was mostly unions that led the efforts for better wages and working conditions to protect women and children in the textile, bottling, and other factories, and in the service industries during this time. Next slide. In the 1960s, women lawyers like Polly Murray and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, my Shiro, were researching, litigating, and slowly creating a legal framework for addressing gender pay equity and sex discrimination in the workplace. Murray's influence on Ginsburg was so profound that in 1971, Ginsburg's first brief to the Supreme Court identified Murray and another ACLU colleague as co-authors, though neither had directly participated in the writing of the brief. Ginsburg later said, "We owe them so much, for they kept the idea and the hope alive." These legal scholars and litigators collaborated with feminists like Betty Friedan and Germaine Greer, who in their writings in the streets, in the offices, in their homes, and in the halls of Congress were leading efforts to combat sex discrimination in American life. By 1975, it was widely and publicly acknowledged that for years, many women accepted sexual harassment as a job hazard, but that now we are speaking out against the indignities of work-related sexual advances and intimidation, both verbal and physical. And those are the words of Lynne Frawley, who is director of the women's section of the Human Rights program at Cornell University, testified more than 43 years ago before the Human Rights Commission of New York City, and she listed the forms such harassment could take: constant layering and ogling of a woman's body, continually brushing against a woman's body, forcing a woman to submit to squeezing or pinching, catching a woman alone for forced sexual intimacies, outright sexual propositions backed by threats of losing a job or not being hired, and forced sexual relations. The New York Human Rights Commission hearing and Ms. Frawley's testimony had as its origins her Cornell colleague being denied a request for a transfer. The colleague, Carmita Woods, had hoped that a transfer would help her to avoid the unwelcome advances of her supervisor. Ms. Woods' refusal to remain silent and her co-workers' vocal and wide support of her resistance led to the creation of an organization, Working Women United. In fact, these women coined the phrase sexual harassment. At their speak out events, secretaries, mailroom clerks, filmmakers, factory workers, and waitresses shared their stories, showing that the problem extended beyond the university setting. The following year, in 1976, the Red Book magazine showed that 80% of those responding had encountered sexual harassment on the job. However, it was not until the late 1980s and 1986 that the Supreme Court, in its pioneering Meritor Savings Bank versus Vincent decision, upheld 3 lower court decisions finding finally that a woman could sue her employer for sexual harassment under the Civil Rights Act of 1974. The decision was unanimous. Do you remember those days? The complainant, Michelle Vinson, an African-American woman, chose to sue after being intimidated by her supervisor into having sex with him at her bank job in the bank vaults and basement. 4 years after that decision, the next major and well-publicized event along the timeline of sexual harassment developments took place in the halls of Congress. Anita Hill's 1991 testimony against the United States Supreme Court Clarence Thomas is perhaps the most famous sexual harassment case in American history. The controversy drew national attention, but its immediate consequences included a doubling of sexual harassment claims filed with the EEOC, larger monetary settlements in court, and more women running for Congress. Next slide. So what is significant, given this historical context, about the Me Too movement is the wide breadth of stories being told by social media, by famous actors, and by generational change. The Me Too initiative, which was started by Tarana Burke in 2006, but it was not until that day in October 2017 when it appears in Alyssa Milano's hashtag on Facebook that 12 million posts were made within the first 24 hours from across the world. What is also significant, although not unprecedented, given the historical context again, about the hashtag #MeToo campaign and the related Time Up initiative, that their stories join the rich celebrities from the arts and entertainment world with workers, women workers in the farms, in the janitorial industry, and other green and blue collar jobs. In an open letter, the National Farm Workers Alliance wrote to Time Up to express their solidarity with the Hollywood actresses. The Time Up initiative, organized by, among others, one of my college roommates, Nina Shaw, who I believe is in the corner there, responded by launching a $14 million defense fund to help defray legal expenses and sexual abuse and harassment cases for those women. The fund is administered by a long-standing organization, the National Women's Law Center. So as you can see, the Me Too campaign will continue to be significant as it finds other creative ways to support the efforts of the country's most vulnerable workers and others who have led and are continuing to lead the way in this area. In the words of Tarana Burke, we have to keep our focus on people of different classes, different races, and different genders. Slide. Next myth. An employer's adoption of a grievance procedure goes a long way in reducing incidents of sexual abuse and harassment. After the 1986 Meritor case, employees increasingly adopted sexual harassment policies as part of their corporate policies. And uniformly, these policies incorporated a grievance process. The effectiveness of such policies is questionable for several reasons. Firstly, despite their widespread usage by employers, sexual harassment remains epidemic in the workplace. Secondly, the success of such grievance policies depends on victims reporting, yet very few victims of sexual harassment formally report complaints. One study found that gender harassing conduct was almost never reported. Unwanted physical touching was formerly reported only 8% of the time. Sexually coercive behavior was reported by only 30% of the women who experienced it. One study went on to state that the fears that stop many employees from reporting harassment are well-founded. One study from 2003 found that 75% of employees who spoke out against workplace mistreatment faced some form of retaliation. One of the research concluded that such results suggest that in many work environments, the most reasonable course of action for the victim to take is to avoid reporting the harassment to the employer. And thirdly, grievance procedures are only as good as the employer complies with them. And if employees have faith, then trust in the employer and the process. And then finally, there's one little litigation trap associated with grievance procedures. Most employers now are able to use the existence of their internal grievance procedure and anti-harassment policies as a defense to liability for harassment in legal suits. Thus, if an employee fails to formally report a complaint with the employer or otherwise complies with each step of the process, the court may not allow the suit to proceed. Third myth. Is that 4 minutes? That's 1 minute? 3 hours. Myth 3. Females holding workplace authority positions who supervise others are less likely to experience sexual harassment than females who do not hold such positions. There are typically two theories. The vulnerable victim model, which is the one that Scott talks about in her study of the Bible, and the other is the power threat model. And under the power threat model, women taking on positions of authority, in fact, take on greater risk of sexual harassment. According to one article, they are targeted as a means of penalizing gender nonconformity. In other words, gender, race, class positions instill in harassers a belief that they have informal power, even when the targets possess greater organizational authority than the harassers do. So it pretty much lays to one clear implication of this is that training procedures must reflect on diversity of sexual harassment models that go beyond the sleazy boss versus powerless female subordinate role-playing exercises to reflect the new realities. Thought on change. There are many resources. Next slide, please. There are many resources available online to address sexual harassment. And these are a few from an entity called medium.com. But if you are the victim of sexual violence or assault, go to the cops, file a report. And if you feel uncomfortable doing that, talk to somebody. Each state has a women's office that will provide for counseling. And you might want to do that regardless of whether you file the report at that time or not. Talk to a coworker or a mentor that you trust. Document everything. I have logs not for this purpose, but just to document my professional accomplishments going back to January 1978. And I haven't thrown them out yet. I plan to, but I haven't thrown them out yet. Network with organizations. Listen, and most of all, be kind to yourself. You are supposed to be in the room. Next slide. If you witness behavior, speak up, say something. Ask for explanation. Keep cool, though. You want to avoid what Susan Walters described as going Thelma and Louise on Foxy Brown on their collective butts. Okay. Next slide. As I said, you are in the room. The first quote. It's a recent quote from an embattled nominee for Consumer Protection Bureau, but I thought her observation was very insightful. And the latter is from a memoir from a young woman that was able to educate herself. And these are remarks from her mentor to her when she was in the dark place. Next slide. Organization, leadership. Remember the scene from Hidden Figures? And Harrison marches into the West Campus and knocks down the bathroom sign. That's leadership, okay? If a sledgehammer does not do, next slide. These are some very practical suggestions from Linda Seabrook, who's General Counsel for Future Without Violence. Okay. And again, the handouts records some of these. Next slide. But for organizations, we typically think about changing the workplace culture to one that promotes respect, equity, and civility. And this change has to come from the top. But the really big picture is possibly best reflected by the culture being built at Salesforce. Salesforce is a $100 billion cloud company based in San Francisco. But each new employee on his or her first day spends the afternoon and weekly thereafter doing community service. The company, well, we do that every day, but the company founder states it's just not about shareholders. Your employees are stakeholders, so are your customers, your partners, the communities that you're in, the homeless that are nearby, your public schools. A company like ours can't be successful in an unsuccessful economy, in an unsuccessful environment, or where the school system doesn't work. We have to take responsibility for all these things. So my final thought is that we need to do a better job of educating ourselves as individuals, as a community, as a country, about the intersectionality of race, sex, gender, ageism, disability, working women, working men, and our identities on the dire issues facing our country, like the prevalence of sexual violence, racial violence, and other threats to our well-being. The picture in the corner is from the webpage of Southerners on New Ground, or SONG. And according to its website, SONG is a regional queer liberation organization made up of people of color, immigrants, undocumented people, people with disabilities, working class and rural and small town, LGBTQ people in the South. We believe that we are bound together by a shared desire for ourselves, for each other, and our communities to survive and thrive. We believe that community organizing is the best way for us to build collective power and transform the South. Out of this belief, we are committed to building freedom movements rooted in Southern traditions like community organizing, political education, storytelling, music, breaking bread, resistance, humor, performance, critical thinking, and celebration. In closing, I have put here a quote from Patricia Williams, who, although is speaking specifically about race, really addresses our possible role with respect to sexual violence and all the other concerns be addressed by song. I think that the hard work of a non-racist sensibility is the boundary crossing from safe circle into wilderness, the testing of boundary, the consecration of sacrilege. It is the willingness to spoil a good party and break an encompassing circle, to travel from the safe to the unsafe. The transgression is dizzyingly intense, a reminder of what it is to be alive. Thank you, Ramona, for suggesting this class.